For years, geneticists kept running into the same strange pattern every time they studied human eye color. Almost every research team that pulled samples from black communities around the world found the exact same result. Dark brown eyes, again and again, showing up with a genetic signature far older and far more complex than anyone expected. It wasn't just a color, it was a code that stretched back further than almost any other trait in the human body. And when scientists finally traced it to its root, they found something that connects nearly every person on Earth, no matter what continent their family comes from. If you have dark brown eyes and you're black, what's written in your DNA is not a small detail. It's one of the oldest, most protected genetic markers our species has ever carried. And the story behind it says something bigger than eye color. It says something about where every human being on this planet actually came from. If this kind of video interests you, hit subscribe, because we break down stories like this every week, stories about DNA, ancestry, and what the science actually says about who we are. Now let's get into what researchers found when they studied the genetics behind dark brown eyes. To understand why dark brown eyes exist, you first have to understand what color actually is, at least on a biological level. Eye color isn't paint. It isn't a dye sitting on top of your eye. It comes from a pigment called melanin, the same pigment responsible for the color of your skin and your hair. The more melanin packed into the iris, the darker the eye appears. Less melanin, and light scatters differently, producing greens, hazels, grays, and blues. Two genes control most of this process. One is called OCA2. The other is called HERC2. Think of OCA2 as the gene that actually produces melanin, like a factory worker doing the job. HERC2 acts more like a supervisor, a switch that tells OCA2 how much to produce and when. In people with dark brown eyes, this switch stays turned on at full strength. Melanin production runs at a high, steady level, filling the iris with pigment. But here's where it gets interesting. Every human being alive today, no matter their skin color, no matter where their ancestors lived, descends from populations that originally had this switch turned all the way up. Every single early human had dark brown eyes. Not blue, not green, not gray. Dark brown, produced by high melanin levels, the same biological setting still found in most black populations today. That means dark brown eyes are not some kind of variation from a default. They are the default. They are the original human eye color, the one carried by every person who ever lived before roughly 10,000 years ago. Every other eye color that exists today is the result of a mutation, a copying error in the genetic code that happened much, much later in human history. Scientists were able to trace one of the biggest of these mutations to a shockingly specific point in time and space. Somewhere near the Black Sea, between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, a single genetic mutation appeared in one person's HERC2 gene. That mutation dialed down the melanin switch, reducing pigment production in the iris. The result was the first blue eyes in human history. Here's the part that surprises most people. Every single person alive today with blue eyes can trace that trait back to this one ancient individual. Not one mutation per region, not multiple separate origins. One person, one mutation, spreading slowly through generations as populations moved, mixed, and settled across Europe and parts of Asia. Every blue-eyed person on Earth is, in a very real genetic sense, distantly related through that single ancestor. Compare that to dark brown eyes. There is no single origin point, no one ancestor to trace it back to, because dark brown eyes never needed one. They were already there from the very beginning. They are the baseline, the ancient, unbroken setting of the human genome, stretching back 300,000 years to the earliest members of our species in Africa. Green and hazel eyes tell a similar story to blue eyes, just a slightly messier one. Instead of coming from one clean mutation, these shades usually come from a partial reduction in melanin, combined with the way light scatters off the small amount of pigment that remains in the iris. Researchers studying ancient skeletal remains across Europe and parts of the Middle East have found that these lighter variations only started appearing in meaningful numbers within roughly the last 10,000 years, right around the same window when farming, settled communities, and denser populations were spreading across those regions. Before that window, the genetic record is remarkably consistent. Dark eyes everywhere, on every continent humans had reached. This is why dark brown eyes carry so much genetic depth. It isn't a new trait bolted onto the human blueprint. It's the oldest surviving trait we have, passed down with almost no interruption through hundreds of thousands of years and hundreds of generations. It's worth pointing out that eye color isn't just a simple on or off switch. It's closer to a dimmer. OCA2 and HERC2 do most of the heavy lifting, but researchers have identified several other genes that fine-tune the final result. Genes like SLC24A4, TYR, and ASEP, each one nudging pigment levels up or down by small amounts. This is why eye color isn't just brown or blue. It's a whole spectrum: amber, hazel, gray, green. and dozens of shades in between, all created by different combinations of these genes interacting with each other. But almost every one of those lighter shades still traces back to the same starting point, a reduction of the original, ancient melanin setting that produced dark brown eyes in the first place. Twin studies have helped scientists understand just how strongly this trait is inherited. Identical twins raised in completely different environments, different climates, different diets, different amounts of sun exposure, still end up with matching eye color almost every single time. That consistency tells researchers something important. Eye color isn't shaped much by environment or lifestyle. It's locked in almost entirely by genetics, set the moment an egg and sperm combine, and it stays fixed for life, which means the deep brown eyes so many black people carry today are not the product of any environmental circumstance. They are a direct, unbroken genetic inheritance passed down the family line for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, you might be wondering, if dark eyes are the ancient default, why did any mutation for lighter eyes survive at all? Wouldn't natural selection just wipe out anything different? Not necessarily. Mutations survive when they don't cause serious harm, and sometimes they stick around simply because of geography and small population sizes. As small groups of early humans moved out of Africa around 70,000 years ago and pushed further into colder, less sunny regions of the world, several unrelated mutations affecting skin and eye pigmentation happened to appear and spread. None of these mutations were forced by necessity in the same dramatic way some people assume. They spread partly through chance, partly through the pressures of much weaker sunlight in northern latitudes, and partly through small founding populations where one person's mutation could spread quickly through a limited gene pool. Meanwhile, in regions closer to the equator, especially across the African continent, there was no advantage to losing pigment. If anything, there was a strong disadvantage. Intense ultraviolet radiation near the equator causes serious damage over a lifetime, including skin cancer and, more importantly for early humans, damage to a nutrient called folate that is essential for healthy pregnancies and normal development. High melanin levels in the skin block that radiation. The same high melanin levels responsible for darker skin are deeply connected to the genetic pathways responsible for dark eyes. This is one of the most underappreciated facts in the entire study of human pigmentation. Skin color and eye color are not separate systems working independently. They are wired together through overlapping genes, shaped by the same evolutionary pressures, adjusted by the same environmental forces acting on early human populations. There's a second piece to the skin pigmentation story that researchers only fully worked out by comparing populations that live at similar latitudes but on completely different continents. Populations in southern India and Aboriginal communities in Australia both evolved dark skin independently of African populations and independently of each other. They are not closely related genetically, and their ancestors separated from the main human migration out of Africa tens of thousands of years apart. Yet both groups ended up with similarly high melanin levels because both were living under similarly intense sun exposure. This is called convergent evolution, the same evolutionary pressure producing a similar physical result in unrelated populations through different genetic pathways. It's the same principle behind why sharks and dolphins both evolved streamlined, torpedo-shaped bodies, despite one being a fish and the other a mammal. Similar pressure, similar outcome, completely different starting material. That pattern shows up again with certain protective genetic traits tied to disease resistance. A gene variant linked to resistance against malaria appears at much higher rates in populations from West Africa, parts of the Mediterranean, and parts of South Asia, regions that, on the surface, looked nothing alike and were historically grouped into completely different racial categories. What actually connects them isn't ancestry or race. It's exposure to the same disease pressure over thousands of years. Malaria shaped the DNA of any population living where it was common, regardless of skin tone, regardless of continent, regardless of the labels later applied to those groups. It's more proof that the traits humans have used to divide each other into races were never reliable markers of shared or separate ancestry. They were local adaptations, showing up wherever the environment demanded them. There's also a theory, still being studied by researchers, that dark eyes may carry an additional protective advantage that has nothing to do with skin at all. The retina at the back of your eye is extremely sensitive to light damage over a lifetime. Some scientists believe higher melanin levels in the eye may offer better protection against certain forms of light-related eye damage and possibly even reduce risks associated with certain age-related eye conditions. The research on this is still developing, but it adds another layer to why dark brown eyes may not simply be a leftover trait. They may be an actively protective one. Now here's where the story expands beyond just eye color and into something much bigger, the actual ancestry hidden inside the DNA of black populations around the world. When researchers began comparing genetic samples from black communities across different continents from West Africa, East Africa, the Caribbean, Brazil, and the United States, they expected to find fairly similar genetic profiles, since all these populations share African ancestry at some point in their history. What they actually found was far more complicated and far more interesting. The genetic diversity within Black African populations alone is greater than the genetic diversity found across the rest of the entire world combined. Two people from neighboring villages in West Africa can carry more genetic differences between them than a random person from Europe and a random person from East Asia. This isn't a small statistical detail. It is one of the most well-established findings in modern population genetics. Africa is not one genetic group. It is the deepest, widest well of human genetic diversity that exists anywhere on the planet. The reason comes back to that same migration story. Modern humans originated in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. For the overwhelming majority of that time, human populations stayed on the African continent, splitting apart, mixing back together, adapting to dozens of different environments. From dense rainforest to open savanna, to highland plateaus, to coastal regions, every one of those environments shaped local populations slightly differently over enormous stretches of time. When a relatively small group finally left the continent around 70,000 years ago, they carried only a fraction of that accumulated diversity with them. Every population outside of Africa today, from Scandinavian communities to indigenous groups in the Americas, descends from that smaller, less diverse founding group. It frequently points to multiple regions, reflecting the reality of the transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly displaced people from many different areas across West and Central Africa, mixing ancestries that would never have combined naturally. A Black Brazilian's DNA often reflects a similar pattern, but shaped by different trade routes, different regions of origin, and centuries of additional mixing with indigenous and European populations already living in Brazil. Even within a single country, the picture is rarely simple. Studies on African American DNA have consistently shown ancestry connections spreading across West Africa, Central Africa, and in smaller amounts East Africa, along with measurable percentages of European ancestry in the vast majority of cases, a direct genetic record of forced relationships during slavery, and smaller but present traces of indigenous American ancestry in many individuals as well. This complexity destroys the old idea that Black identity represents one single genetic category. It never did. Caribbean populations frequently show a similar pattern, layered with additional genetic input depending on which islands and which colonial histories shaped their specific family line. None of this is random. Every percentage point on those reports is a fragment of a much larger, forcibly disrupted history, families torn from specific regions, transported across an ocean, and mixed together in ways their ancestors never would have experienced back home. The DNA remembers all of it, even when written records don't. Which brings us to one of the most important findings modern genetics has ever produced, and it applies directly to the story of dark brown eyes. Race, as a biological category, does not hold up under genetic analysis. It never has. The physical traits people use to sort others into racial categories, skin tone, eye color, hair texture, facial structure, represent an incredibly small slice of the human genome, less than 0.1% of our total genetic material. These are the traits humans can see with the naked eye. So historically, they became the traits used to build entire social systems, hierarchies, and justifications for oppression. Those rankings were never rooted in real biology. They were rooted in the politics, economics, and prejudices of empire building, and later used to justify colonization, forced labor, and violence on a massive scale. Modern DNA research has quietly and thoroughly dismantled every one of those old claims. There's no gene for racial superiority. There's no genetic marker separating one race from being fundamentally different from another in ability, intelligence, or worth. What actually exists is a single, continuous, deeply interconnected human species, with variation that blends gradually across geography rather than snapping into neat, separate boxes. This doesn't mean the social side of race stopped mattering the moment scientists figured this out. Race is a lived experience shaped by history, law, culture, and generations of unequal treatment, is very real and has had very real consequences on wealth, health, education, and opportunity. Understanding that race has no solid genetic foundation doesn't erase any of that. What it does is remove the last excuse. It removes the idea that inequality could somehow be explained away as some kind of natural biological difference between groups of people. The data makes it clear that explanation was never true. Whatever gaps exist in the world today were built by systems and choices not written into anyone's DNA. And that brings the story back to something almost poetic about dark brown eyes specifically, because dark brown eyes are, quite literally, the genetic thread connecting almost every human being who has ever lived to the very beginning of our species. Before there were continents full of different eye colors, before there were mutations creating blue eyes near the Black Sea or green eyes scattered through parts of Europe and the Middle East, there was one original setting written into the human genome. Dark, deep brown, protected by high melanin, carried by every early human ancestor in Africa, and passed down largely unchanged through the vast majority of human history. If you're black and you have dark brown eyes, you are looking through a trait that has survived, almost completely intact, for roughly 300,000 years. Every migration, every ice age, every environmental shift humanity has ever faced, and this particular genetic setting held steady through all of it. That's not something small. That's one of the oldest continuously surviving traits in the entire human species. Ancient DNA research has actually let scientists watch this story unfold in real skeletal remains. When researchers extracted and sequenced DNA from early hunter-gatherer skeletons found across Europe, skeletons that are thousands of years old, the genetic markers pointed clearly to dark skin and dark eyes, even in individuals whose remains were found as far north as modern-day Britain and Scandinavia. It wasn't until farming populations and later herding populations moved in from other regions, bringing new gene variants with them, that lighter skin and lighter eyes became common in those areas. In other words, dark pigmentation wasn't just the African starting point. It was the standard human condition across most of the inhabited world for the vast majority of our species' history, right up until a series of relatively recent, regionally specific mutations changed the picture in certain populations. There's another layer to this story that researchers only fully understood once they compared enough population data from around the world, and it has to do with how deeply connected all of humanity actually is, no matter how different we might look on the surface. Genetic studies have shown that if you trace back far enough, every single person alive today shares a common ancestor who lived within roughly the last few thousand years. Go back further, to somewhere around 7,000 years ago, and something even more remarkable shows up in the data. Every person alive on Earth today who has any descendants at all is an ancestor of every single human being currently alive. Every population, on every continent, funnels back into the same shared human family tree within a relatively short window of time on an evolutionary scale. This means the old idea of separate, pure bloodlines, one group descending cleanly from one ancient population and staying that way forever, simply isn't how human ancestry works. Everyone's family tree is a web, not a straight line. It reaches backward and connects to populations across the entire globe, blending and remixing again and again throughout history, long before anyone had invented the modern racial categories we still use today. So when someone with dark brown eyes and black skin looks into a mirror, what they're seeing is not a narrow, isolated genetic story. They're seeing one of the oldest, most continuous, most protected genetic signatures that our species has ever carried, a trait that predates almost every other visible human characteristic, and a trait that quietly links them to the very first populations of modern humans who ever existed. Scientists studying this pigmentation data weren't just cataloging eye color. They were tracing a living record of human migration, adaptation, and survival, written directly into the body. Every dark brown eye carries a small piece of that 300,000-year-old story, a story about a species that started in one place, spread across the entire planet, adapted to dozens of different environments along the way, and still, underneath every surface difference, remains one connected human family. That's the real answer behind the question of where dark brown eyes actually come from. Not a new trend, not a random accident. The original human blueprint carried forward almost unbroken across the entire span of human history, still visible today in millions of people around the world. It also helps explain something a lot of people notice but rarely think about scientifically: why dark brown remains, by a wide margin, the single most common eye color on the planet today. Even after tens of thousands of years of migration, mutation, and mixing, even after entire regions of the world developed their own lighter variations, the ancient default never got replaced. It simply spread alongside every population that carried it, staying dominant because it was never outcompeted, never selected against, just quietly and consistently passed down, generation after generation, across every continent humans eventually settled. There's a reason genetic researchers describe traits like this as conserved. In biology, a conserved trait is one that stays stable across huge stretches of time because it works, because it isn't causing problems that evolution would need to correct. Dark brown eyes fit that description almost perfectly. Nothing about the environment, nothing about survival, nothing about reproduction ever pushed hard enough against this trait to meaningfully shrink its presence in the human population. It simply endured, the same way certain mountain ranges or river systems remain largely unchanged while everything around them shifts over time. And maybe that's worth sitting with for a second. In a world that spends so much energy sorting people into categories based on how they look, the actual science tells a very different story. It tells us that the deepest, oldest, most enduring parts of who we are as a species aren't found in the differences we've been taught to focus on. They're found in what has survived, unchanged, connecting every one of us back to the same distant beginning. Every field of science that has taken a serious, unbiased look at this question has arrived at the same conclusion. Dark brown eyes are not a limitation, not a lesser variation, not something separate from any imagined default. They are the default, the original, and in many ways the most successful eye color our species has ever produced, still carried by billions of people today, still functioning exactly as it has for hundreds of thousands of years. There's a kind of quiet strength in that. A trait doesn't survive 300,000 years by accident. It survives because, generation after generation, it kept working. If this video taught you something new, that's exactly what this channel is here for. We dig into the real science behind the traits that make people who they are, the DNA stories most people never get to hear. If you want more of this, subscribe, turn on notifications, and stick around, because there's a lot more of this history still waiting to be uncovered.